What's happening there today, everybody? Brandon coming to you from Riverblade Knife and Fly Shop. In today's Shop Talk segment, talking a little bit about fly selection. Alright, so when we're talking about picking a fly, specifically trout fishing in the southeastern United States, there's a couple of considerations that I normally look at. Now, a lot of times you're going to hear, oh, okay, what's hatching this time of year, and what do I need to match bug-wise and all that kind of stuff. But here's the thing, in the southeastern United States, most of our rivers see a wide variety of insect life. They're going to see multiple mayflies, multiple caddis, stoneflies, scuds and freshwater shrimp, crustaceans, all kinds of nonsense. So most of the time our rivers don't see a single big enough bug hatch of one particular bug that's the only thing that the trout are keying in on. Now there's a few exceptions here and there. Most of the time it's a bigger tailwater. You know, there's some big tailwaters that are out there in North Carolina, Tennessee, and places like that that might see a large enough hatch of one particular bug. You know, maybe it's a blue-winged olive in the winter or a sulfur mayfly in the summertime kind of thing, where the trout seem to key in on that specific bug. But even then, if you had a different fly that you were floating through there, you probably wouldn't go skunked. You'd still catch something. You just might not catch as much as if you had that specific thing. But all of our other rivers, I mean like 90% of them, don't see a big enough hatch of a single insect like that the fish are just looking for that particular one. So they normally are what we would call opportunistic feeders that are going to take whatever you present properly that looks like a meal, regardless of what it is at that particular time. So normally when I'm picking a fly, I consider a couple of things. The first thing I consider is, what are the water conditions that I'm fishing? So is that river low, crystal clear water, slow moving, maybe we hadn't had rain in a while, or is it higher than normal flow, maybe the river's dingy from some rain, there's a lot more current than's normally there, that kind of thing. Or another consideration on water conditions is time of day. Is it early in the morning, first thing in the day, the sun's still behind the trees, hadn't come over onto the water yet, or is it, you know, right after midday and the sun's directly overhead shining down on the water, or is it cloudy, maybe even rainy a little bit? You know, these types of things to me is a consideration. And then, what is the mentality of the fish that I'm fishing for? So, yeah, they're all trout, but what kind of trout are we talking about? Are we talking about a dumb hatchery trout that just got put in the river from a stock truck yesterday? Or are we talking about a native stream-born wild fish that's been in the river his whole life? Are we talking about fish in a heavily pressured catch and release river that sees a lot of fishermen and they're caught and they're put back and they're caught and they're put back? The mentality of these fish are all different. So I also consider that when I'm picking a fly. I'll also consider about how I need to approach an area when I'm picking a fly. So if I need to cover a lot of water quickly, or I need to search for some fish, maybe it's a river I've never been to before and I don't know where they are, or I just need to find out the areas in the river they're holding, a streamer is a lot more effective at covering water a lot faster. I can literally walk and fish at the same time. I can keep moving, keep casting, cover a lot of water quickly when I'm searching for fish. So if that's your consideration, then, you know, drifting flies under an indicator is a lot more time consuming. It's a lot more thorough in the area that you're fishing, but you can't cover nearly as much water with that as you can running and gunning with a streamer pattern. So if you're trying to cover water fast, you pick a streamer. Once you've found some fish and you're trying to cover that area thoroughly, you might switch over to drifting some flies. And when it comes to dry fly fishing versus fishing under the surface, you know, trout feed under the water, under the surface of the water, 365 days a year. They're only going to feed on top when something's kind of got their attention. So if you're, you know, saying, hey, I want to catch fish on a dry fly, most of the time you're going to catch as many, if not more fish, if you just stick to fishing under the surface. Now, if you happen to be standing in a river where there's a hatch going on and you see fish rising to the surface like crazy, then by all means, tie on a dry fly and you'll probably catch more fish at that point because, again, something's already got their attention on top. If you're fishing wild trout water, a higher elevation somewhere in the summertime where it's just small stream pocket water, a lot of times you'll never actually see a fish rise to the surface to take something other than the dry fly you're throwing. You got to think, you've got a lot of terrestrial bugs out that time of year, so they see all kinds of insects flying around and hitting the water. Plus, those small wild trout streams usually are not very deep anyway, so it's not like a fish has to move very far to take something off the surface. They just don't normally see a lot of things on the surface, so when something lands on it, like a dry fly of yours, they jump on it pretty quick because, again, they're fairly opportunistic fish. So you can attack a small trout stream pocket water pretty much all late spring, summer, early fall with just a dry fly dropper rig and catch all the fish that you want. So if we're specifically talking dry flies for a minute, you know, there's a couple that will kind of cover all your bases for you. A Parachute Adams dry fly here, for instance, will pretty much cover about 80% of all mayflies out there in terms of its profile shape, what it looks like, and what it'll do for you. And then an elk hair caddis pattern will pretty much take care of any caddis that are out there in the water that you're seeing. Those two flies alone will cover just about any hatch scenario you run into in the southeast. Now in the summer months, you got a lot of terrestrial bugs flying around. I like some yellow-bodied things, yellow stimulators, yellow humpies. There's a lot of bugs that we have with yellow in them. So something bushy, attractor-wise like that with yellow is always a good option to have. Realistically, you could have a fly box with a few Parachute Adams, a couple of elk hair caddis, and then either some yellow-bodied stimulators or humpies, and do just fine any time when it's warmer weather. You may have to go to some tiny stuff if you're trying to dry fly fish in the winter, like a small blue-winged olive. But again, most of the time in the winter months, you're going to catch more fish if you're not concerned about dry fly fishing. So now let me talk about a couple of specific scenarios. So if it is early in the morning or late in the evening, the sun's not out on the water yet, or maybe it's cloudy, or if you're dealing with high water, murky, dingy water from rain runoff, I like to do a rig of, if I'm throwing nymphs, 2 flies where one of them is rather bright, colorful, so maybe it's a worm pattern or an egg pattern. I will go with something bright with some color, and then I will trail it with a second fly that is much more neutral in color, something black, something olive, something brown, and smaller in size. And that way I can kind of let the fish tell me what they're in the mood for. I've seen a lot of times if the sun is not on the water, that they might hit one of those flies versus the other, but then once the sun gets on the water, it will flip-flop. Normally, to be honest with you, in my experience, they will hit the bright, crazy colored thing when the sun is not on the water better than they will the neutral colored thing, and then when the sun gets on the water, they switch. They'll start hitting that brown, that black, that olive thing, and not necessarily hitting the bright one as much. Another consideration on your water condition is simply this. If it is low, slow-moving, crystal clear water, what can you get away with on a cast that will splash down and not spook the fish? Sometimes you literally have to go to a dry fly rig with maybe a dropper nymph behind it just because that water is so shallow and slow moving and clear that it's the only thing you can lay down soft enough that the fish don't scatter when it hits the water. I've experienced this numerous times fishing the tail ends of runs and pools where that water is maybe 6 inches deep or a foot deep at most, and there's a handful of fish holding out in there and the water is really slick and calm and not really moving very fast. If you try to lay down a streamer in there or you try to lay down a nymph rig and an indicator, it just spooks everything around it. But you can feather a dry fly in there with a little dropper nymph behind it and it won't spook the fish off. Even if they're not necessarily taking the dry fly, it at least allows you to throw something in there that you can see and you can watch as your indicator without spooking the fish off. It's a lot more natural. If you think about what's going on in nature, if that river is really slow moving and low and clear, chances are a big stonefly nymph like this is probably not getting washed downriver too much because he's strong enough to stay on the rocks and not get pushed downriver. Now, if that water gets up and high moving from rain, then you're going to see a lot more stoneflies this size getting pushed downriver. So bigger flies are just more naturally seen in higher water that's got a lot more flow to it, whereas slower moving, lower levels typically are going to be seeing smaller things come down the river. These are not nearly as frightening, I guess, in one sense to a trout when they see something small coming down the river. So low, slow-moving water, crystal clear water, I tend to stick towards flies that are size 14 and smaller. I throw a lot of 16s, 18s, maybe 20s if I have to. If that river is up, dingy from rain, and things of that nature, I might go with something larger. Also, when we're talking nymph patterns, some generic stuff like pheasant tails and hare's ears and prince nymphs will cover the vast majority of all mayfly larvae that you run into. A couple of stonefly patterns, black and golden stonefly patterns in a few different sizes. are always in our rivers 365 days a year, so that's going to take care of any stoneflies that you might have to deal with. And then other than that, you want a couple of worm patterns, brightly colored options, egg patterns, and things like that. Sometimes that bright colored crazy thing is just what the fish are looking for. Other time it's the neutral colored things. I like to throw a double rig with both, let them tell me what they're in the mood for. So again, just to reiterate, your fly presentation in terms of what do you need to do to not spook the fish, what kind of rig do you have to throw in there to accomplish either the depth you need to achieve or the finesse that you need to land the cast, or the water conditions are saying, hey, you need to be throwing smaller, more natural colored things because of it being really low and clear, or if it's a lot of water volume from rain, maybe you need to throw bigger flies. That kind of consideration for me is usually a lot more important than what the actual fly is. And then if you're drifting flies, your ability to achieve natural drifts is always more important than the actual fly itself. If you approached 10 different fly fishermen on the river that were all catching fish, there's a high probability that they're all throwing a different fly. But they are at least knowing how to cast it, present it, and how to drift it properly to catch the fish. If the fish thinks it's drifting right and it looks like a meal to them, they'll probably eat a wide variety of flies that you throw at them. So just to summarize again, when I'm picking flies out of my fly box wherever I'm going to fish, I'm normally considering water conditions, whether it's low water, high water, time of day, amount of sunlight on the water, and I'm also considering the mentality of the fish. Are they stockers that just got put in there? Are they heavily pressured catch and release fish that's been there a while, they're a lot smarter? Are they wild native fish that's up in the middle of nowhere that I hardly ever see a fisherman? Those types of considerations to me will dictate what flies I start with. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of my process of picking a fly when I'm going out to the river. If you fish the same rivers over and over and over, you'll tend to get to where you know what's probably going to work for you before you even leave the house. So repetition in some areas definitely helps. I'm not necessarily concerned about am I matching a hatch somewhere or am I getting a specific bug right. I'm more concerned about my technique, my presentation, and then just, fishing the conditions. So I hope that helped you out. Next time we'll see you again on Shop Talk.